In 1930, scarcely anyone outside of Germany had the least idea of what National Socialism entailed. As the decade drew to a chilling close, there was hardly anyone who did not know and fear its proponents, those who came to be known as the Nazis.
Danzig war Deutsch, Danzig ist Deutsch geblieben, und Danzig wird von jetzt ab Deutsch sein, solange es ein deutsches Volk gibt und ein deutsches.
In 1938, the Wehrmacht stretched its iron fist towards its neighbors, gingerly at first, but with increasing confidence. In March, German troops were in Vienna, bringing Austria back into the Reich. To everyone else, it was military annexation. It was the first step towards almost total European domination. Both Britain and France failed to understand what was happening. Complacency born of past military glories veiled the antiquated thinking of their respective governments. When Hitler claimed restitution of the Sudetenland, lost to Czechoslovakia through the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, France and Britain abandoned their ally without so much as a wave goodbye. Ignoring Russia's offer to help defend the Czechs, Chamberlain and French Prime Minister Reynaud met Hitler in Munich in September 1938 to approve the dissection of Czechoslovakia. Russia was excluded from the talks. This self-inflicted schism opened between the great powers encouraged Hitler still further. At the Munich conference, he performed like a statesman. Chamberlain and Reynaud were led to the gallows without knowing, and the treaty they signed, restoring the Sudetenland to Germany, was in fact a death warrant for their own countries. Elated, Chamberlain basked in the approval of his country, understandably anxious to avoid British blood spilled for the cantankerous Continentals. The wounds of World War I had left terrible scars.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Very few growled their disapproval and warned of dire consequences as Winston Churchill did. To Hitler, mesmerized by the power he now seemed to wield, it was as though Chamberlain and Reynaud had personally opened the floodgates for him and ushered him through. He did not need a second invitation. The wave became unstoppable. German troops occupied the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. By the end of the year 1938, the Nazis' hate campaign against the Jews had rampaged through Germany, where property was smashed, looted, confiscated, and non-Aryans arrested. The road to Auschwitz was free. By March 1939, Hitler had taken control of the whole of Czechoslovakia, breaching the terms of the Munich Agreement. His attention was now on Poland. When a Soviet-German pact was signed in August, Chamberlain was stunned. The French no less so. Their duplicity over Czechoslovakia was soon going to cost them more than hurt pride. For in a secret agreement, the Germans and Russians had arranged for the partition of Poland. Aware of the necessity to strike quickly, Hitler ordered his forces over the Polish border in the early hours of September the 1st, in the wake of Luftwaffe raids. Like a child, he felt the need to concoct a pretext for doing so, and informed the downcast Europeans that the Poles had fired upon German border troops. It was the first of a string of ridiculous and mendacious claims to which Germany and the world would be subjected over the ensuing war years. Poland was engulfed by the first implementation of the Blitzkrieg tactics that were to leave Britain reeling and France prostrate at Hitler's feet. Britain and France officially entered the war on September the 3rd. For Poland, Chamberlain's words of support were worth less than a handful of dust. Goebbels and Himmler were the names to remember, names that opened a new and terrible chapter as German forces sliced through the country. The guns fell silent. France and Britain dared to breathe a sigh of relief. A phony war, as the Americans termed it, began. Whilst the Allies wasted their time in fantasies about invading Germany, Hitler was already 3 steps ahead of them, having begun to plan his next move during the Polish invasion. This time the prize was breathtaking in the enormity of its prestige: France. Hitler correctly forecast that a prolonged war with Britain and France would exhaust Germany's capacity to fight. If Germany were to delay, Britain would rearm to the extent where the Allies would be unassailable. Time may be considered to be an ally of the Western powers rather than ours, he commented in 1939. Despite the forewarning, when Hitler revealed his intention of an offensive in the West, practically all of his generals were unpleasantly aghast. They did not share their leader's belief in the power of the new weapon. Tragically, the triumphal success of Hitler's plans humbled the Wehrmacht officers for the remainder of the war. Now they were Hitler's inferiors. Hitler had originally intended his invasion in the West to follow hard on the heels of the Polish adventure. Critical generals and then the deteriorating weather conditions thwarted him. As the new year arrived, not even the German High Command officers could have foreseen what ignominious place 1940 would come to hold in the history of terror. On January the 10th, a plane carrying a German major and the entire set of plans for the Western attack fell into Belgian hands when the pilot lost his way in icy weather and was forced to land in Belgium. Goering ranted, Hitler stayed calm, displaying the level-headed thinking that would have saved countless lives had he reacted equally dispassionately in later war years. Having rejected the option of immediate attack, he simply replaced the invasion plans for the Western Front using Manstein's strategies. Erich von Manstein was Chief of Staff of Army Group A and widely considered to be one of the ablest of the younger generals. The main thrust of the attack would be in the Ardennes region. Shortly after the code word Danzig crackled over the field radios, 4,000 German airborne forces descended on Holland, backed up by 30 German divisions. Land forces crashed over the Dutch border and advanced into Belgium and Luxembourg. Of the 4,000 parachute troops, there were only 180 casualties, a telling affirmation of their efficiency. The invasion had already been underway for 2 hours before the French commander-in-chief, Gamelin, was roused from his slumbers by officers still skeptical that the attack was noteworthy. The Belgians, rocked to their heels, belatedly invited the Allied forces to take up positions on Belgian soil. Holland and Belgium had remained rigidly neutral, and any defense was inevitably going to be improvised at best, and at worst, haphazard. As the British Expeditionary Force moved into position, it was going, tragically, where Hitler wanted it to. For one man, the news of the offensive caused personal turmoil. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, firmly wedged into an era that was disintegrating before his eyes, Hitler had used him shamelessly. Already ill, the confidence of the British people lost to him. He resigned on May the 10th. A broken man, he did not live to see the end of the year. Little did the man who followed Chamberlain into number 10 Downing Street know that he was destined to save Britain, and with her, crack open and destroy the iron shell of Nazi hegemony in Europe. His inheritance was a world that was falling apart. His talent was inspirational leadership. His name was Winston Spencer Churchill. As Chamberlain left number 10, Hitler watched his daring brinkmanship bring dramatic results. Whilst infantry forces pierced through the defences along the Dutch border, The Hague came under attack from airborne troops. The Luftwaffe, numerically superior to the Allies at this point, increased the confusion. Help was little better than ragged, and the battle for Holland lasted just 4 days. With the bombing of Rotterdam, the Dutch capitulated on May the 14th. In a parallel offensive, a brilliant tactical stroke robbed the Belgians of their main defensive position at Ben-Emael, a supposedly impregnable fortress with a 1,200-man garrison. German gliders landed 78 troops, who pinned down the Belgians until ground troops arrived. Only 6 German soldiers were killed before the fortress was taken. The fall of Ben-Emael was a severe blow to French defensive planning. Allied forces were immediately sent to bolster the Belgian lines. No one realized that the reason these forces were not being hit by the Luftwaffe was that they were walking headlong into a gigantic trap. Inadvertently, the French High Command's redeployment of these forces, 3 French armies and the British, opened the way for one commander of the Panzers to achieve his objectives in spectacular style. General Heinz Guderian was to find his place in the history books as the architect and most talented proponent of swift tank penetration. Without his single-minded devotion to rapid tank incisions behind enemy lines, France may well have withstood the German onslaught. The enormity of his achievement in France was enhanced by the fact that French tanks outnumbered the Germans and were more than a match for most of them in design and firepower. In the first tank battle that ever took place, the Battle of Hanau that was fought between the 12th and the 14th of May, the French lost 105 tanks. The Germans lost 165. It was to prove a hollow victory, for whilst the French were warding off the German attacks in Belgium, German forces had crossed 70 miles of thick woodland and difficult terrain in the Ardennes to emerge at the French border on the Meuse River on May the 12th. Most of the advancing force did not encounter a single French soldier en route. Not believing that this area could be used for an attack, the French had severely neglected its defense. Von Manstein had pinpointed the Achilles heel of the French defenses alarmingly well. Whilst Allied bombers were dispatched to northern Belgium, 1,222 tanks, 134,000 soldiers, 1,600 vehicles, assembled around the village of Sedan, were about to cause the biggest military upset imaginable: the collapse of the proud Grande Nation. The surprise was absolute, and the invasion inflicted a defeat so humiliating that it left searing wounds in the French psyche which have not healed to this day. France was proud of its Maginot Line, the series of defensive positions that guarded its borders with Germany from Switzerland to Luxembourg. Unfortunately, its assumed invulnerability was based on warfare that mirrored the fighting in World War I. The mental blockage it caused in the minds of French military strategists was infinitely greater than its physical deterrence, which was nil. Built at a cost of billions, it was a series of fortified gun positions linked with underground tunnels, a truly impressive achievement. the advancing Wehrmacht paid it a dubious compliment by completely ignoring it. Confirmation of German intentions was provided by the Luftwaffe in the early hours of May the 13th. With 1,000 planes at its disposal, wave after wave swept over the French positions on the Meuse in 8 hours of strafing and bombing. It was one of the heaviest air raids in military history, and although little damage was inflicted on the French bunkers, the effect on French morale was devastating. With the defenders pinned down, the way was open for the advance. At about 3 p.m. on May the 13th, 1940, German forces moved towards the River Meuse. The success of the entire enterprise depended on the ability of the assault engineers to get across the river and eradicate the French machine gun nests, which the bombing had done little to break down. As German troops hurled rubber dinghies into the water and waded after them, the French machine guns opened up, causing the first deaths in the battle for France. German machine guns replied, their fire protecting the frightened young men desperate to reach the far shore. French artillery soon began to hamper the crossings and wiped out the boats of an entire division, one of 3 based at the town of Sedan. Had it not been for the strong leadership and initiative of men like Erwin Rommel, later to gain fame in Africa, the crossings may not have been as successful as they were. The French defenders were able to prevent the Germans from crossing in large numbers during the first 24 hours. Nonetheless, by the end of the day, 3 German bridgeheads had been established, and a wedge 5 miles deep pushed into France. Only then, far too late, did the French become aware that they were staring down the gun barrels of the main German invasion force. Guderian's 3 panzer divisions were over the river by the afternoon of the 14th, and already turning westwards. A belated French counterattack was repulsed, and his path through France to the Channel coast lay undefended before him. The only barrier he now had to surmount was the doubt of his superior commander, von Kleist. In a heated argument over the telephone, Guderian wrangled a 24-hour window of advance from him, perhaps the most vital 24 hours in the entire war. That evening, French Prime Minister Reynaud made a telephone call to Churchill, describing the situation as very serious. Churchill could not appreciate the monumental crisis crouching behind those 2 words. When Reynaud contacted him again on the 15th, he made Churchill aware that the British Prime Minister had underestimated the problem. "We have been defeated," he told Churchill. He was right. Even though failure need not have been a foregone conclusion, German men and armor were pouring into France. Churchill was stunned. The French had proclaimed their army to be better than at any time in their history. The most perfectly trained and faithful mobile force in Europe was Churchill's own description. Had it been nothing more than wishful thinking? Numerically, the French should have been able to overcome the German forces arrayed against them. 5 million trained men were available for mobilization. In contrast, the Germans had mobilized 98 divisions, and despite the propaganda, the majority of the soldiers were anything but highly trained killing machines. During the Polish campaign, many had been in service for barely 1 month. Air Marshal Dowding was implacably against sending more RAF planes to France. The defense of Britain would be compromised, he argued successfully. All through the long hours of May the 15th, the French put up ferocious resistance, and again their tanks matched the German panzers. But the tactical thinking of the French commanders could not match the new style, flexible warfare practiced by their German opposites. Lack of adequate reinforcements hamstrung the defenders. Roads choked with retreating soldiers or refugees slowed deployments, and any Allied counterattacks were dispersed without too much difficulty. One despondent commander of the French 9th Army in the Ardennes wrote that everything, communications as well as the course of the fighting, was in utter chaos. Confusion through having hurriedly and erratically relocated Air Force planes in the wake of the invasion meant that bringing them back into effective action was almost impossible. French planes were now hidden so effectively, not even the French general in command of the Air Force knew where most of them were. The Luftwaffe were left to their own devices. There had been a desperate air raid by 170 French and British bombers over Sedan on the 14th. 85 of the Allied pilots never returned to base. In any case, Guderian's actions made the battles flaring behind him practically irrelevant. Churchill arrived in Paris on the 16th. To find the capital awash with panic. Whole archives were being burned, so sure was the administration that the Germans would arrive. Churchill's query about the state of the French reserve forces was met with a resigned shrug of the shoulders by Commander-in-Chief Gamelin. "There aren't any," he replied. Churchill returned to London in a state of numb foreboding. France was an ideal country for the new warfare that later came to be termed Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. Northern France was a plain, perfectly suited for armoured movement. Moreover, it had a good system of roads, which would enable swift travel up to and between fronts. Guderian, anxious to capitalize on his 24-hour release from high command interference, pressed forward. The panzers of his van converged with those of his fellow commanders, Haut and Reinhardt, who had crossed the Meuse at Dinant and Monthermé. With Rommel's panzers also penetrating ever deeper, this swelling tide of armour, some 95 kilometers wide, crushed the weakening French resistance and thundered onwards through a landscape devoid of any obstruction. An emptiness that told of Allied ineptitude and subsequent paralysis. Here, Churchill's thinking was also at fault. He argued against the withdrawal of Allied armies in Belgium, assuming that the Germans would soon halt the advance in order to reinforce. He could not know that he was forging another ring into the ever-lengthening chain of wrong decisions. On the day Churchill arrived in Paris, the 16th, Rommel was responsible for one of the most daring feats of the campaign. Splitting off 2 tank battalions from the bulk of his forces, he thrust forwards with them, leaving an ever-widening corridor between himself and his front-line armour. With solid determination, he drove through the day and the night, avoiding towns, until he came to Le Cateau at 6 a.m. the following day. He had covered 110 kilometers. It had been a dangerous and unconventional undertaking, which further demoralized French troops suddenly confronted with German armor where they least expected it. On the 17th, Reynaud brought legendary First World War hero Marshal Philippe Pétain into his government. Pétain had no illusions that his country was already lost, and that he was only to arrange peace terms. No one knew how or where to effectively counteract the German advance. As a result, no concerted counterattack was made. Several localized counterattacks bore little fruit. Colonel de Gaulle, later to find fame as President of France, launched an attack on Guderian's panzers with a cobbled-together group, the 4th Reserve Armored Division. It caught the Germans unawares, but met the same fate as all the other assaults, being quickly swept aside. Guderian, when confronted yet again with orders to halt, became so enraged that he was once more given free rein. In fact, a retreat had already begun. As the German armies in the lowlands pressed on towards the coast, the order was issued on the 16th that the Allied armies in Belgium were to withdraw, to prevent them from being totally cut off. Communications to the south had already been severed by Guderian. French officers were in tears, completely out of their depth. When the War Office in London received a warning that the BEF might even have to be withdrawn from the continent, they decided to mount an immediate and heavy counterattack at Arras. An enterprise laden with bad omens, for the demoralized French were unable to react as swiftly as the severity of the situation demanded. Gamelin was replaced on the evening of May the 19th as Commander-in-Chief by the 73-year-old General Maxime Weygand, the most decisive action the government had taken for a while. A complete waste of time nonetheless, because the 20th found the first German units under the command of the unstoppable Guderian watching the waves of the English Channel near Abbeville by the Somme. Roads and communications to Paris were now severed. The next disaster threatened to render not only France but also Britain impotent. Before the bitter finale, the last attempt to prevent what now seemed inevitable began on the 21st of May at Arras, to the southwest of Lille. 2 British battalions, supported merely by a few squadrons of light French armour, turned onto Rommel's units. The result proved what effect a determined effort could have. Rommel lost more tanks in one day than he had at any other time. Properly handled, this shock could have forced a significant turning point. Weygand enthusiastically threw up smoke screens, offering large divisions of non-existent troops to attack in the south. At one point, he claimed that the French had retaken Amiens, a completely spurious statement which served to make Churchill clutch at straws and agree to Weygand's plans equally enthusiastically, to the great frustration of his commanders in the field, who reacted with a curt, "The man's mad." The news from the coast was devastating. Whilst the bulk of British forces were fending off von Bock's troops, Guderian began to race along the coast, reaching Boulogne on the 22nd. As Guderian prepared for the thrust into Dunkirk, most of the BEF troops were many miles distant from the town. Had he moved, the BEF would have been forced to capitulate intact, an extraordinary coup for Hitler. What the Führer then did dumbfounded everyone, and his extraordinary decision made it possible for Britain to resist the Wehrmacht for long enough to eventually bring about his downfall. Hitler ordered his panzers to stop their advance. Guderian was thunderstruck. The air was thick with demands, questions and protests, all to no avail. The order had come from the Führer himself. Nothing could be done. For 3 days the panzers were idle. 3 days crucial to Britain and the world. To this day, the puzzling reason behind Hitler's Haltebefehl, the order to halt, cannot be accurately explained. Chief of Staff Halder noted that his leader was in a state of high tension, continuously flying into rages at his generals, whom he believed to be on the verge of sabotaging the whole campaign. Despite Hitler's wary admiration for the British, he certainly had no intention of sparing them. He believed Goering, who, not for the last time in the war, misleadingly boasted of the prowess of his Luftwaffe. They could easily finish off the trapped Allied forces, he told Hitler. A more likely explanation was the altered role being attributed to Army Groups A and B, which required time for adjustment of forces. Although the order was intercepted by the British and French, it had no effect on their actions. It was almost as though the stroke of good fortune in the chaos had mesmerized them. Optimism that the attack at Arras had stoked had evaporated by the night of the 23rd to the 24th. The decision to remove the troops from the untenable salient was made. In contrast, the BEF and the troops trapped with them were now in the grip of an unfolding tragedy, a race to fall back on Dunkirk before the Germans cut them off from the sea. The all-important docks had been more or less destroyed, so that only the outer dock was still usable, although only at high tide. Churchill had already given the go-ahead for assembling a fleet of smaller vessels to help in the battles the previous week. The Admiralty codenamed the project Operation Dynamo. A message had been broadcast on BBC radio asking for owners of private boats to register with the Admiralty. No one could have envisioned the extraordinary feats that those boats would accomplish in the trials ahead. Operation Dynamo is to commence, came the order from the British Admiralty at 6:45 on May the 26th, and by that afternoon, the embarkation of British troops was underway. The French were predictably angered when they found out, and Weygand refused to order French troops to escape until 3 days had elapsed. They were to defend the bridgehead, from which the British had estimated that only 45,000 of the 200,000 trapped men could be rescued in the first 2 days before the Germans closed in. Further inland, 7 French divisions doggedly defended their positions and the British retreat until they simply ran out of ammunition. What took place on the waters around Dunkirk in the dark days between the 26th of May and the 4th of June 1940 has gone down in history as a remarkable episode of stoic endurance in the face of adversity. It marked one of the greatest triumphs of the indomitable British spirit in the history of the British Isles. 40 destroyers were ready to defend 129 merchant and passenger ships already designated for the evacuation. From the 31st, following a BBC radio broadcast detailing the drama unfolding on the beaches in France, an incredible armada of small vessels, from rowing boats and yachts to fishing boats and fireboats, launched onto the English Channel from along the British coast heading for Dunkirk. Their brave contribution was small in terms of numbers rescued, but immeasurable to the soldiers' morale, and the legendary spirit of Dunkirk they represented was to sustain the British in the dark months ahead. The men leaving France did not know just how fortunate they really were. The slaughter of 2 groups of British prisoners by the SS on the 27th and 28th of May showed the world the atrocities still to come under the barbarity of the National Socialist regime. Only the thick pall of smoke that deceived the Luftwaffe into believing they had destroyed more than they actually had prevented even greater death and injury. The decision was made to start evacuation from the beaches. As these sloped gently into the sea, this meant that smaller vessels would have to run the gauntlet and come in as close as possible to ferry the men to the larger ships. The miracle was about to begin. On the second day of Operation Dynamo, nearly 12,000 men were taken from the harbour, together with 6,000 from the beaches. Still not enough to make total evacuation feasible before the Germans broke through. Two long wooden walkways alongside the harbour walls could be used to speed up the process. The rickety open planks and the 16-foot difference between tides made embarkation a dance with death, but the numbers being taken on board jumped impressively. On the 31st, 68,000 men were rescued, the highest number on a single day. One of the creaking walkways enabled 200,000 men to escape before the operation ceased. None of the boats was safe until it reached England. It was the Luftwaffe who posed the greatest threat. The situation was made all the worse when, for 2 days, the British Admiralty withdrew all its modern destroyers, fearing to lose them, after 4 destroyers had been put out of action on one day. "2,000 men were lost at sea out of a total of almost 340,000 that returned safely to England. As May turned to June, the troops still on the beaches were nearing total exhaustion. Yet discipline remained unbroken amongst the crowds of men waiting patiently beside the burned-out hulks of their armour that littered the sands. Although the best German infantry had been transferred elsewhere, the French and British were able to give the Luftwaffe almost no opposition in the skies, and the German successes mounted. They dived relentlessly over the beaches throughout the evacuation, with the first heavy bombing raid taking place on the 29th. In the light of this terrible gamble with death, it was truly miraculous that so many men escaped. Fortunately, the sand blunted the effect of the bombs and bullets that seared down onto the static troops below, another factor that prevented Dunkirk from becoming a tale of unbearable tragedy. Daytime evacuation was abandoned. The disorganization that had clouded the entire invasion period continued to the end. British ships sailed for England half empty because the French troops could not be located. On the 2nd of June, only 26,000 men were taken away, but the message delivered to Churchill was, "The evacuation of the BEF is complete." French soldiers were still waiting. 53,000 were evacuated during the last 2 days of the operation, under covering fire from British naval vessels and RAF planes. On the 4th of June, it was all over. For the British. The last ships steamed away from the burning port in the early hours, leaving the beaches strewn with the abandoned equipment of the Allied armies. Almost 340,000 soldiers and army personnel had been rescued. More than anyone could have dared to hope for. Without them, there would very probably have been no D-Day almost 4 years later. On that day, the Germans entered Dunkirk. French troops were packed onto the quays at the docks. It is estimated that 30 to 40,000 of them went into captivity. Britain was now alone. The two countries saw the events in clashingly different lights, of course. For the British, the point of no return had not been reached as long as Britain still remained free of invasion. For the French, it had been all or nothing. In France, opinion was divided as to whether to continue the fight. 1.5 million men were still under arms, a force that could have achieved a great deal. There were also huge reserves of aircraft and men in North Africa. The possibilities were tantalizing, except that the French had lost their nerve and were critically short of time for decisions. None were made. Paris was bombed on the 3rd of June, and Plan Red, Hitler's scheme for the final downfall of France, swung into action on the 5th. French troops were severely outnumbered by this time. There were pitifully few mobile reserves left. Lined up on the new front line of the rivers Somme and Aisne were 40 of their badly hit infantry divisions and the reduced forces of 3 tank divisions. In contrast, the Germans brought up 50 German infantry divisions and 10 panzer divisions. Rouen was taken by German troops on June the 9th. The Germans began their advance into the Champagne region. Once the infantry had broken the French lines, the panzers again stormed ahead, reaching the Swiss border and cutting off the defenders in the Maginot Line. The now ignominious fortress was attacked from the French side. It soon capitulated, a useless monolith that represented all that had been wrong in the French prosecution of their defense. The French soldiers fought on, dying and injured, whilst the government abandoned Paris for Tours, dragging a mass exodus of Parisians in its wake. Weygand, no doubt more fearful of the fate of the architecture than his country's troops, ordered that the capital should not be defended. Nothing could prevent the victorious Wehrmacht driving on to claim its greatest prize. The date that is burned into the collective memory of the French is the 14th of June 1940, the day German troops filled the streets of Paris. Weygand was soon informing his ministers that an armistice was the only course left to them. When Pétain agreed, adding that he would not leave French soil even if ordered to do so, it was clear that France was fatally divided and its downfall imminent. Allied troops were still being evacuated from other parts of the French coastline, whilst in Italy, Mussolini was abruptly infused with a desire for his own slice of glory. He ordered his troops to participate in the spoils of what he assumed was a crushed France and invade. He was dealt a powerful and swift repulsion by the French troops in the south, who were more ready than their political leaders to stand and be counted. They now moved to Bordeaux, where, on the 16th, they received the news that an appeal to the United States for help had been rejected. Only Prime Minister Reynaud possessed the will to fight on. His attempt to persuade the government to continue resistance from exile in North Africa was trodden underfoot. He resigned. Pétain took over the office of Prime Minister, incarcerating Reynaud 6 weeks later. De Gaulle was in England, from where he conducted operations against the occupation as leader of the Free French armies. France had been strangled in the Nazi grip. Pétain transmitted a request for an armistice as German troops entered the Rhone Valley. It was announced one day later on May the 17th. He was permitted to form a puppet government in Vichy. The hero of Verdun would from then on be tainted with the stain of collaboration with the Germans. There was one final act of humiliation to deal with before Hitler returned to Berlin. The signing of the armistice after the 1914-1918 war had taken place at Compiègne in a railway carriage. The carriage still existed. Hitler directed that this same carriage at Compiègne should witness the scene of France's capitulation in 1940. On June the 21st, the fall of France's honor was absolute. The unthinkable had become indisputable. France was in the hands of fascists, and Hitler had risen from small-time revolutionary to the most powerful and feared man in Europe. Jubilantly, he strutted around his newest acquisition. The world was astounded and apprehensive. When he returned home, Hitler was greeted with wild enthusiasm. The eternal enemy had been crushed, German pride restored. Surely now the war was over. German soldiers and civilians alike were as joyful at this prospect as they were of a humiliated France. Very few realized that this had only been a foretaste of the terror that was to engulf them too in a few short years. The fall of France left Britain in a perilous situation. The country prepared itself for the expected invasion. Thanks to the selfless exploits of a few, it never materialized. France faced internal conflicts that reflected her own divisions and neuroses, resistance and collaboration side by side. Through occupation, France was spared the worst outpourings of modern warfare, but the deep shock of defeat and occupation, coupled with the manner and apparent ease with which her collapse was accomplished, still hangs darkly over her history even into a proud new century. France had been the backbone of the Continental armies. Without her, the future looked bleak. Its true manifestation was simply beyond imagination.